The Saffron Robe by Tuesday Lobsang Rampa. Read to you by BlueFriend in beautiful British Columbia, November 2016. Chapter 1. Strange shadows rippled before my uncaring gaze, undulating across my vision like colorful phantoms from some remote, pleasant world. The sun-dappled water lay tranquil, inches from my face. Gently, I inserted my arm below the surface, watching the lazy little waves which the motion caused. Squinty-eyed, I peered into the depths below. Yes, that big old stone, that's where he lived, and he was coming out to greet me. Idly, I let my fingers trail along the sides of the now motionless fish. Motionless, save for the easy movement of the fins as he kept station by my fingers. He and I were old friends. Often I would come and drop food into the water for him before caressing his body. We had the complete understanding which comes only to those who have no fear of each other. At that time, I did not even know that fish were edible. Buddhists do not take life or inflict suffering on others. I took a deep breath and pushed my face below the surface, anxious to peer more closely into another world. Here I felt like a god gazing down at a very different form of life. Tall fronds waved faintly in some unseen current. Sturdy water growths stood erect like the giant trees of some forest. A sandy streak meandered along like a mindless serpent and was fringed with a pale green plant looking for all the world like a well-kept lawn. Tiny little fish, multicolored and with big heads, flashed and darted among the plants in their continual search for food and fun. A huge water snail laboriously lowered itself down the side of a great grey rock so that it could do its task of cleaning the sand. But my lungs were bursting. The hot noonday sun was scorching the back of my neck, and the rough stones of the foreshore were digging into my flesh. With a last look round, I rose to my knees and, thankfully, breathed deep of the scented air. Here, in my world, things were very different from the placid world I had just been studying. Here there was bustle and turmoil and much scurrying about. Staggering a little from a healing wound in my left leg, I stood and rested with my back against a favorite old tree and looked about me. The Norbulinga was a blaze of color, the vivid green of the willows, the scarlet and the gold of the island temple, and the deep, deep blue of the sky, emphasized by the pure white of the fleecy clouds which came racing over the mountains from India. The calm waters of the lake reflected and exaggerated the colors and lent an air of unreality when a vagrant breeze roiled the water and caused the picture to sway and blur. All here was peaceful, quiet, yet just beyond the wall, as I could see, conditions were very different. Russet-robed monks strode about carrying piles of clothes to be washed. Others squatted by the side of the sparkling stream and twisted and turned the clothes so that they should be well soaked. Shaven heads gleamed in the sunlight and, as the day progressed, gradually became sun-reddened. Small acolytes, newly joined to the lamasery, leaped about in a frenzy of excitement as they pounded their robes with big, smooth stones that they should look older, more worn, and so give the impression that the wearer had been an acolyte longer. Occasionally the sun would reflect bright shafts of light from the golden robes of some august lama journeying between the Potala and the Pargo Ling. Most of them were men of staid appearance, men who had grown old in temple service. Others, a very few, were young men indeed, some of them being recognized incarnations, while others had progressed and advanced on their own merit. Striding about, looking very alert and fierce, were the proctors, large men from the province of Kham, men charged with the task of maintaining discipline. Erect and bulky, they carried huge staves as a sign of their office. No intellectual these, but men of brawn and integrity, and chosen for that alone. One came close and glowered inquiringly at me. Belatedly recognizing me, he strode off in search for offenders worthy of his attention. Behind me, the towering bulk of the Potala, the home of the god. Skywards, one of the more glorious works of man. The multi-hued rock glowed gently and sent many-hued reflections skittering across the placid waters. By a trick of the shifting light, the carved and colored figures at the base seemed imbued with life, causing them to sway and move like a group of people in animated discussion. Great shafts of yellow light, reflected from the golden tombs on the Potala roof, sped off and formed vivid splashes on the darker mountain recesses. A sudden thunk and the creak of bending wood caused me to turn to this new source of attraction. An ancient bird, grey and molting, older than the oldest acolyte, had alighted on the tree behind me. Eyeing me with remarkably beady eyes, it said, "Crack," and suddenly shuffled so that its back was towards me. It stretched to full length and violently flapped its wings while expelling an unwanted gift in my direction with astonishing force and precision. Only by a desperate jump aside did I escape being a target. The bird shuffled round to face me again and said, "Crack, crack," before dismissing me from its attention in favor of the greater interest elsewhere. On the gentle breeze came the first faint sounds of an approaching group of traders from India. The lowing of yaks as they protested at their drivers' attempts to hurry them. The asthmatic creak and wheeze of old dry leather harness, the plod and the shuffle of many feet, and the musical tinkle of small pebbles being jostled aside by the caravan. Soon I could see the lumbering beasts piled high with exotic bundles, great horns tossing above shaggy eyebrows, the rise and fall as the huge animals stumped along with their slow, untiring gait. The traders, some with turbans, some with old fur hats, others with battered felt headgear. "Alms, alms for the love of God," cried the beggars. "Ah," they shouted as the traders moved on unfeelingly, "your mother is a cow who mated with a boar. Your seed is the seed of Shaitan. Your sisters are sold in the marketplace." Strange odors came to twitch at my nostrils, making me draw in a deep breath and then sneeze heartily. Scents from the heart of India, bricks of tea from China, ancient dust being shaken from the yak-borne bales, all were wafted my way. Into the distance faded the sound of the yak bells, the loud talk of the traders, and the imprecations of the beggars. Soon the ladies of Lhasa would have wealthy callers at their doors. Soon the shopkeepers would be haggling over prices demanded by the traders. raised eyebrows and higher raised voices at the inexplicably increased prices. Soon I would have to be going back to the Potala. My attention wandered. Idly, I watched the monks at their ablutions, 2 of them ready to come to blows at the threat of thrown water from one. Rapidly the proctors moved in, a flurry of motion, and 2 chastened monks were marched off, each in the iron grip of guardians of the peace. But what was that? I let my gaze search the bushes. 2 tiny glittering eyes looked anxiously at me from near ground level. 2 small grey ears were inclined intently in my direction. A minute body was crouched, ready to rush should I make a false move. A little grey mouse was pondering on the possibility of passing between me and the lake on its way home. As I looked, he darted forward, all the time keeping his gaze on me. His care was misplaced. Not looking where he was going, he charged headlong into a fallen branch, and with a shrill squeak of terror leaped a foot into the air. He jumped badly, jumped too far to the side. As he came down, he missed his footing and fell into the lake. The poor mite was making no headway, and was in danger of being seized by a fish when I stepped knee-deep into the water and scooped him out. Carefully drying him with the end of my robe, I waded back to the shore and placed the shivering little bundle on the ground. Just a faint blur, and he vanished down the little burrow, no doubt thankful for his escape. Above me, the ancient bird uttered a crack of derision and creaked laboriously into the air, flapping noisily in the direction of Lhasa. In the direction of Lhasa? That reminded me I should be going in the direction of the Potala. Over the Norbu Linga wall, monks were stooping, examining the washing drying upon the ground. Everything had to be carefully scrutinized before it could be picked up. Little brother beetle may be strolling across the clothing, and to roll up the garments would be to crush little brother, an act to make a Buddhist priest shudder and turn pale. Perhaps a little worm had taken shelter from the sun beneath a high lama's laundry. Then little worm must be removed to safety so that his destiny may not be altered by man. All over the ground monks were stooping, peering and gasping with relief as one little creature after another was safely delivered from certain death. Gradually the piles of washing grew as everything was heaped ready to be taken into the Potala. Small acolytes staggered under the newly washed burdens. Some could not see over that which they were carrying. Then would come a sudden exclamation as the little fellow tripped and sent all the clothes flying to the dusty ground, or even to the mud of the river bank. From high on the roof came the throb and the boom of conchas and the blare of the great trumpets, sounds which echoed and re-echoed from the distant mountains, so that at times, when conditions were right, vibrations pulsed about and beat at one's chest for minutes. Then suddenly all would be still, quiet, so quiet that one could hear one's own heart beat. I left the shade of the friendly tree and made my halting way through a gap in the hedge. My legs were shaky. Some time previously I had sustained a grave burn to my left leg. It did not heal well, and then had 2 legs broken when a great gust of wind had lifted me from the Potala roof and thrown me down the mountainside. So I limped, and for a short time was exempt from doing my share of household duties. My joy at that was offset by having to study more that the debt may be set straight, as I was informed. Today, wash day, I had been free to wander and rest in the Norbu Linga. Not for me a return by way of the main entrance, with all the high lamas and abbots treading on one's heels. Not for me the hard steps where I used to count 98, 99, 100, 101. I stood by the side of the road while lamas and monks and pilgrims passed by. Then there was a lull, and I limped across the road and ducked into the bushes. Pulling myself along the precipitous mountainside, I made my ascending way above the village of Sho and joined the side path between the courts of justice and the Potala. The way was rugged but beautiful, with its profusion of small rock plants. The air was cooling, and my battered legs were beginning to ache intolerably. I gathered my tattered old robe about me and sat upon a convenient rock so that I might regain my strength and my wind. Over in the direction of Lhasa, I could see little sparkling fires. The traders were camping in the open, as Indians often did, rather than stay at one of the hostelries. Farther to the right, I could see the shining river as it left on its immense journey all the way to the Bay of Bengal. "Yurar, yurar," said a deep bass voice, and a hard, furry head butted me in the knees. "Yurar, yurar," I answered amiably. A blur of movement, and a big black cat sat on my legs and pushed his face into mine. "Honorable Puss-Puss," I said through the thick fur, "you are choking me with your attentions." Gently I put my hands on his shoulders and moved him back a little so that I could look at him. Big blue eyes, slightly crossed, stared back at me. His teeth were as white as the clouds above, and his widespread ears were alert to the slightest sound. Honorable Puss-Puss was an old and valued friend. Often we snuggled together beneath some sheltering bush and talked to each other of our fears and our disappointments and all the hardships of our hard life. Now he was showing his affection by kneading on me, opening and closing his big paws, while his purrs roared louder and louder. For a time we sat together, and then, together, we decided it was time to move. As I toiled ever upwards, stumbling from the pain in my damaged legs, Honorable Puss-Puss raced ahead, tail stiffly erect. He would dive into some undergrowth, and then, as I drew level, would spring out and cling playfully to my flapping robe. "Now, now," I exclaimed on one such occasion, "this is no way for the leader of the Cat Jewel Guard to behave." In reply, he laid his ears back and rushed up the front of my robe, and reaching my shoulder, jumped sideways into a bush. It amused me to see our cats. We used them as guards, for a properly trained Siamese cat is fiercer than any dog. They would rest, apparently asleep, by the side of the sacred objects. If pilgrims attempted to touch or steal, then these cats, always in pairs, would seize him and hold him by menacing his throat. They were fierce, yet I could do anything with them, and being telepathic, we could converse without difficulty. I reached the side entrance. Honorable Puss-Puss was already there, energetically tearing great splinters off a wooden post by the side of the door. As I lifted the latch, he pushed the door open with his strong head and vanished into the smoky gloom. I followed much more slowly. This was my temporary home. My leg injuries were such that I had been sent from Shakpuri to the Potala. Now, as I entered the corridor, the familiar odors smelled home. The ever-present aroma of incense, the different perfumes according to the time and purpose for which it was being burned, the sour, rancid, and stinging smell from the yak butter which we used in our lamps for heating small articles such as kettles, and which we use for sculpture during the colder days. The memory lingered on, no matter how hard we scrubbed, and we did not scrub too hard. The scent was always there, permeating everything. A less pleasant smell was that of yak dung, which, dried, was used for heating the rooms of the aged and infirmed. But now I stumbled on, moving down the corridor, past the flickering butter lamps, which made the gloomy corridors gloomier still. Another perfume was always present in all lamaseries, a perfume so familiar that one did not notice it unless hunger had sharpened one's perceptions. Sampa, the smell of roasted barley, the smell of Chinese brick tea, the smell of hot butter. Mix them and the result is the inevitable, the eternal Sampa. Some Tibetans have never tasted any other food than Sampa. They are born to the taste of it, and it's the last food they taste. It is food, drink, and consolation. It provides sustenance during the hardest manual labor. It provides food for the brain, but it has ever been my belief it starves sexual interest, and so Tibet has no difficulty in being a celibate state, a land of monks, and with a falling birth rate. Hunger had sharpened my perceptions, and so I was able to appreciate the aroma of roasted barley, hot butter, and Chinese brick tea. I walked warily down the corridor and turned left when the scent was strongest. Here, at the great copper cauldrons, monk cooks were ladling roasted and ground barley into bubbling tea. One hacked off several pounds of yak butter and tossed it in. Another upended a leather sack of salt which had been brought by tribesmen from the highland lakes. A fourth monk, with a 10-foot paddle, was stirring and swirling everything together. The cauldron bubbled and foamed, and bits of twigs from the brick tea rose to the surface, to be swept off by the monk with the paddle. The burning yak dung beneath the cauldron gave off an acrid stench, and the clouds and clouds of black soot. The whole place was coated, and the black sweat-streaked face of the monk cooks could have been those of entities from some deep hell. Often the monk with the paddle would scrape floating butter from the cauldron and toss it into the fire. There would be a sizzle, a flare of flame, and a new stink. "Ah, Lab sang," yelled the monk above the clatter and clamor. "Come for food again. Help yourself, boy, help yourself." I took from inside my robe the little leather bag in which we monks kept a day's supply of barley. Shaking the dust out, I filled it to capacity with fresh roasted, fresh ground barley. From the front of my robe, I withdrew my bowl and looked at it carefully. It was a bit grubby, a bit caked. From the big bin against the far wall, I took a handful of very fine sand and thoroughly scoured my bowl. It helped clean my hands as well. At last I was satisfied with its state, but another thing had to be done. My tea bag was empty, or rather, All it now contained was the small sticks, bits of sand and other rubbish always found in the tea. This time I turned the bag inside out and picked free the debris. Returning the bag to its correct state, I took a hammer and knocked a suitable lump off the nearest brick of tea. Now it was my turn. Once again I took my bowl, my newly cleaned bowl, and held it out. A monk took a ladle and slapped my bowl brimming full of sampa. Thankfully, I retired to a corner, sat on a sack, and ate my fill. As I ate, I looked about me. The kitchen was full of the usual hangers-on, idle men who lounged about gossiping, telling the latest scandal, adding a bit to rumors just heard. Yes, Lama Tencheng is going to the rose fence. 'Tis said he had a quarrel with the Lord Abbot. My friend heard it all, he says. People have many strange notions about lamaseries or monasteries. It is often thought that monks spend the whole day in prayer, contemplation, or meditation, looking good and saying only good things. A lamasery is a place where, officially, men of religious intent congregate for the purpose of worship and contemplation, that the spirit may be purified. Officially. Unofficially, a robe does not make a monk. In a community of several thousand, there must be those who deal with household duties and repair and the maintenance of the fabric. Others look after accounts, police the lower classes, teach, preach. Enough. A lamasery may be a large town with an exclusively male population. The workers will be the lowest class of monks and will have no interest in the religious aspects of the life, paying only lip service to it. Some monks have never even been in a temple except to clean the floor. A large lamasery will have a place of worship, schools, infirmaries, stores, kitchens, hostels, prisons, and almost everything that would be found in a lay town. The main difference is that in a lamasery, everything is male, and on the surface, everyone is devoted to religious instruction and action. Lamaseries have their earnest workers and their well-meaning, bumbling drones. The larger lamaseries are cities or towns with many buildings and parks spread over a wide area. Sometimes the whole community is encircled by a high wall. Other lamaseries are small, possessing but 100 monks, and all housed in one building. In some remote areas, a very small lamasery may have no more than 10 members. So, they range from 10 to 10,000, the tall and the short, the fat and the thin, the good and the bad, the lazy and the energetic. The same as in some outside community, no worse, and often not much better, except that lamastic discipline may be almost military. It all depends on the abbot in charge. He may be a kind, considerate man, or he may be a tyrant. I stifled a yawn and wandered out into the corridor. A rustling in one of the store alcoves drew my attention. I was in time to see a black tail vanish between leather sacks of grain. The cats were guarding the grain, and at the same time catching their mouse supper. On top of one of the sacks I saw a contented-looking cat cleaning his whiskers and fairly smiling with satisfaction. The trumpets sounded, reverberating through the echoing corridors, and sounding again. I turned and made my way to the inner temple, to the sound of many shuffling sandals and the slap of bare feet. Within there was the depressing gloom of early evening, with the purple shadows stealing across the floor and lining the columns with ebony. The sides of the windows were edged with gold as the sun's fingers reached out and gave a last gentle caress to our home. Swirling clouds of incense drifted along, and, when pierced by a shaft of sunlight, showed to be a myriad of dust motes of living colors almost endowed with life. Monks and lamas and humble acolytes filled in and took their places upon the floor, each adding his own splash of color to be reflected upon the vibrant air. The gold robes of the Potala lamas, the saffron and red of others, the dark brown of monks, and the sun-bleached garments of those who habitually worked outside, all sat in lines in the approved position. I, because my severe leg injuries prevented me from sitting as prescribed, was relegated to a back position where I was hidden by a smoke-wreathed column so that I should not destroy the pattern. I looked about me, seeing all the boys, the men, and the very old sages who were attending to their devotions, each according to his understanding. I thought of my mother, the mother who had not even said goodbye to me when I had left home. How long ago that seemed! To enter the Shakpuri lamasery. Men, all men. I knew only about men. What were women like? I knew that in some parts of Tibet there were monasteries where monks and nuns lived together, married, and raised their families. The incense swirled on, the service droned on, and the dusk deepened into darkness, barely relieved by the flickering butter lamps and the softly glowing incense. Men. Was it right for men to live alone, to have no association with women? What were women like, anyhow? Did they think the same as we? As far as I knew, they chattered only about fashion, hairstyles, and silly things like that. They looked awful frights, too, with all that stuff they put on their faces. The service ended, and I climbed painfully on shaky legs and stood with my back to the column so that I could not be toppled over in the first rush. Finally, I moved into the corridor and made my way to the dormitory. A chill wind was blowing through the open windows, blowing straight down from the Himalayas. The stars were shining bright and cold in the clear night sky. From a window below me, a quavering voice was reciting, "Now is the noble truth as to the origin of suffering. It is the craving thirst that causes the renewal of becomings." Tomorrow, I reminded myself, and for perhaps a few days after, we were going to have special lectures on Buddhism from one of the great Indian teachers. Our Buddhism, Lamaism, had departed from the strict orthodox lines of Indian Buddhism in much the same way as the Christian belief had various forms, such as Quaker and Catholic. Now, though, the night hours were far advanced, and I turned away from the frosty window. About me, acolytes were sleeping, some snoring. A few tossed restlessly as they thought, maybe, of home, as I had so recently been thinking. A few very hardy souls were trying to practice the correct lamastic sleeping posture, sleeping upright in the lotus position. We had no beds, of course, nor mattresses. The floor was our table and our bed. I took off my robe, shivering naked in the chill night air, and then wrapped myself in the blanket which all Tibetan monks carry as a roll over one shoulder and caught at the waist. Cautiously lowering myself to the floor in case my treacherous legs betrayed me, I bundled my robe beneath my head as a pillow, and I dropped off to sleep. Chapter 2. You, boy, you, sit correctly. Sit in the manner prescribed. The voice was like rolling thunder. Then 2 heavy hands smote my ears, left, right. For a moment I thought all the temple gongs had clanged together. I saw more stars than were visible even during the clearest night. A hand grasped the collar of my robe, lifted me up to my feet, and shook me like a duster being shaken from a window. "Answer me, boy, answer me!" the angry voice shouted. But he gave me no opportunity to answer, just shaking me until my teeth rattled and my bowl fell out and rolled across the floor. My bag of barley fell and the thong became untied, loosening a shower of grain into the shocked air. Satisfied at last, the fierce man threw me aside like a rag doll. Sudden silence descended, and there was a tense air of expectancy. Cautiously, I fingered my robe at the back of my left leg. A thin trickle of blood was oozing from the ruptured scar. Silence. I looked up. An abbot was standing in the doorway facing the fierce man. "The boy has been gravely injured," he said. "He has the inmost one's special permission to sit in the manner most comfortable. He has permission to answer a question without rising." The abbot walked over to me, looking at my blood-reddened fingers, and said, "The bleeding should soon stop. If it does not, visit the infirmary." With that, he nodded to the fierce man and left the room. "I," said the fierce man, "have come specially from Mother India to tell you the truth of Buddhism. You in this country have broken away from our tenets and formed your own brand called Lamaism. I have come to tell you of the original truths." He glared at me as though I were his mortal enemy. Then he told a boy to give me my bowl and my now empty barley bag. For some moments while this was being done, and while my spilled barley was being swept up, he paced around the room as though seeking another victim. He was a tall, lean man, very brown of skin, and with a great beak of a nose. He wore the robes of an old Indian order, and he looked as though he despised us. The Indian teacher walked to the end of the room and mounted the small raised platform. Carefully he adjusted the lectern to his exact requirements. Fumbling in a leather bag which had stiff sides and square edges, he brought forth some remarkable sheets of paper. Thin paper, a hand span by 2 hand spans, not at all like the long, thick sheets that we were used to. They were thin, translucent, and almost as pliable as cloth. His strange leather bag fascinated me. It was highly polished, and at the center of one narrow side it had a shiny piece of metal which clicked open when a button was touched. A piece of leather formed a highly convenient handle, and I determined that one day I would have just such a leather bag. The Indian rustled his papers, frowned severely at us, and told us the tale we had long known. I watched in profound interest the way in which the end of his nose wobbled as he spoke, and how his brow formed a sharp ridge as he squinted at the pages. The story he told us, the old familiar one. 2,500 years ago, the people of India were disillusioned with their religion. The Hindu priests were degenerate, thinking only of earthly pleasures. thinking only of personal gain. The people whom they should have been helping were turning away from their old beliefs, turning to anything that would offer a scrap of hope. Prophets and soothsayers roamed through the land with forecasts of doom and torture. Animal lovers decided that animals were better than humans, so they worshipped animals as gods. The more cultured Indians, the deep-thinking men who feared for their country, turned aside from the religion of their ancestors and pondered deeply on the sorry state of man's soul. One such man was a high Hindu Raja, an enormously rich warrior king. He worried and fretted about the future of his only son, Gautama, who had so recently been born into a troubled world. The father and family had the strongest desire that Gautama should grow up as a warrior prince and later inherit his father's kingdom. An old soothsayer called in to prophesy had said that the young man would be a prophet of great renown. To the stricken father this was a fate worse than death. Around him he had many examples of young upper-class men renouncing the life of comfort and going forth as pilgrims, barefooted and clad in rags, to seek a new spiritual life. The father determined to do everything possible to thwart the prophecy of the soothsayer. He laid his plans. Gautama was an artistic, sensitive young man with a keenly alert intellect which was able to sweep through subterfuge and penetrate to the heart of the matter. Autocratic both by birth and upbringing, he had yet consideration for those under him. His perceptions were such that he became aware that he was carefully guided, shielded, and permitted to meet only those who were personal servants or caste equals. At the time of the soothsayer's prophecy, the father had given the strictest orders that his son be at all times shielded from the evils and sorrows which troubled those beyond the palace confines. The boy was not to be permitted to go out alone. His travels there were to be supervised, and he should be allowed to meet no one who had poverty or suffering. Luxury, and only luxury, was to be his lot. All that money could buy was his. All that was unpleasant was ruthlessly excluded. But life cannot continue thus. Gautama was a young man of spirit, and with more than his share of determination. One day, unknown to his parents, unknown to his tutors, he slipped from the palace, and with a carefully chosen servant went driving beyond the palace grounds. For the first time in his life, he saw how other castes lived. 4 incidents provoked the most profound thoughts, and thus changed the course of religious history. At the outset of his journey, he saw an old man, trembling with age and illness, leaning heavily upon 2 sticks as he painfully dragged himself along. Toothless, blind with cataract, and senile, the old man turned a vacant face towards the young prince. For the first time in his life, Gautama realized that old age came to everyone, that with increasing weight of years, one was no longer active and supple. Badly shaken, the young prince continued his drive, full of strange and morbid thoughts. But there was another shock in store. As the horses slowed for a sharp turn, Gautama's horrified gaze chanced to alight upon a miserable figure sitting, rocking and moaning by the side of the road. A man covered with suppurating sores, emaciated and disease-ridden, was groaning as he picked yellow scabs from his body. The young Gautama was shocked to the core, sick at heart, perhaps physically sick too. He pondered the question as he was driven along. Must one suffer? Does suffering come to all? Is suffering inevitable? He looked at his servant who was driving. Why was he so calm? The young prince wondered. The driver was unconcerned, as if such sights were common. This, then, must be why his father had shielded him. On they drove, with Gautama too stunned to order otherwise. Fate or destiny had not finished, though. At an exclamation from Gautama, the horses were slowed. They came to a halt. At the side of the road was a naked corpse, grotesque and bloated by the fierce heat of the sun. A flick of the driver's whip and a dense cloud of flies, feeding upon the body, rose in a swarming mass. The body, discolored and odorous, was revealed completely to the young man's sight. As he looked, a fly wandered out of the dead mouth, buzzed and settled again. For the first time in his life, Gautama saw death, knew there was death at the end of life. The young man mutely ordered the driver to return. He sat thinking of the impermanence of life, sat thinking of the beauty of a body which yet had to fall into decay. Was beauty so temporary, he wondered? The wheels revolved, the dust rose in clouds behind. The young prince sat in thought, morose and withdrawn. By chance or fate he looked up in time to see a well-clad, serene monk striding along the road. The monk, calm and tranquil, radiated an aura of inner peace, of well-being, of love for his fellow men. The brooding Gautama, shocked to the core of his being by the sights he had seen, now received another shock. Were peace, contentment, tranquility, all the virtues, to be found only if one withdrew from everyday life and became a religious? A monk? A member of some mystic order? Then he resolved, would become as that monk. He would withdraw from the life of the palace, withdraw from the only life he knew. His father raged and stormed, his mother wept and pleaded. The servant was banished from the kingdom. Gautama sat alone in his room, thinking endlessly of the sights he had seen, thinking that if he had seen so much in one short excursion, his only excursion, how much more suffering and misery must there be. He refused food, pined, moped, and just sat wondering what to do, how to escape from the palace, how to become a monk. His father tried in every way he knew to lift the load of sorrow and depression afflicting the young prince. The best musicians were ordered to play constantly, that the young man should have no quiet in which to think. Jugglers, acrobats, entertainers of all types were tried. The kingdom was scoured for the most beautiful maidens, girls versed in the most exotic arts of love, that Gautama should be aroused by passion and thus lifted from his despondency. The musicians played until they dropped from exhaustion. The maidens danced and practiced erotic exercises until they too collapsed fainting from exhaustion. Then only did Gautama take notice. He stared with horror at the awkward postures of the fallen musicians. He looked with shock at the naked maidens, pale with the pallor of collapse, with the cosmetics standing out vivid and ugly now that the glow of health had vanished. Once again he pondered the impermanence of beauty, how transient it was, how quickly it fled, how sad, how ugly was life. how garish and tawdry were painted women when their immediate activity had ended, he resolved to leave, resolved to shun all that he had known, and seek tranquillity wherever it might be found. His father ranted, doubled, and then trebled the palace guard. His mother screamed and became hysterical. His wife, poor woman, collapsed, and all the palace ladies wept in concert. Gautama's baby son, too young to know what was going on, yelled and shrieked in sympathy with the misery around. The palace advisors waved their hands helplessly and poured out torrents of words, to no avail. For days he worked at means whereby he could leave. The palace guards knew him well. The people in the kingdom knew him not at all, for he had so rarely left the palace confines. At last, when he was almost in despair, the thought occurred to him that he had only to disguise himself from his immediate guards. From some friendly servant who was well rewarded and who immediately left the kingdom, Gautama obtained old and ragged clothes such as the mendicants wore. One night at dusk, before the palace gates were locked, he donned the old clothes, and with his hair tousled and his hands and face well covered with dirt, he shuffled out with the beggars who were being turned out for the night. Into the forest he went, away from the main roads and people, fearing that his ignorance of the ways of everyday life would betray him. All the night he wandered, striving to reach the limits of his father's kingdom. He had no fear of the tigers and other wild animals prowling at night. His life had been so shielded that he did not know the danger. Back in the palace, his escape had been discovered. The whole building was searched. The outbuildings, the parks. The king rushed around shouting orders. Armed men stood at the alert. Then everyone went to bed to await the dawn when a search could be mounted. In the women's quarters there was wailing and lamentation at the fury of the king. Gautama crept through the forest, evading meetings where possible, being silent to all questions when it was not. From growing crops he took his food, living on grain, berries and fruits, drinking from cold, clear springs. But the tale of the strange wanderer who did not behave as a wanderer should eventually reached the palace. The king's men swept forth in strength, but could not catch the fugitive, as he always hid in the thickets where horses could not go. At last the king decreed that all the dancing girls should be taken to the forest, and they should go in pursuit of Gautama and attempt to lure him back. For days they danced and weaved their way through the forest glades, always in sight of Gautama, always acting out their most seductive dances. At last, near the limits of his father's domain, Gautama stood forth and said that he was going into the world in search of spirituality and he would not return. His wife rushed towards him, the baby in her arms. Gautama heeded not her pleas, but turned away and continued his journey. The Indian teacher, having got thus far in his story, which we knew as well as he, said, "From the then decadent Hindu religion a new belief was at that moment formed, a belief that would bring comfort and hope to many. For this morning we will end our session. This afternoon we will continue. Dismiss." The others rose to their feet, bowed respectfully to the teacher, and left. I had trouble. I found that my robe had stuck to my leg scar with dried blood. The teacher left without giving me a glance. I sat in considerable pain and wondered what to do.
Just then an old cleaning monk hobbled in and looked at me in surprise. "Oh," he said, "I saw the teacher leave and I came to clean. What is the trouble?" I told him, showed him how the great scar had burst open, how the blood had poured out, and how I had plugged the hole with my robe. The old man muttered, "Tisk, tisk," and hurried out as fast as he could with his own deformed legs. Soon he returned with the infirmarian. The pain was like raging fire. I felt that my flesh was being torn away from the bones. "Ah, my son," said the infirmarian, "you are as one born to trouble, as surely as sparks fly upwards." He sighed and muttered, "But why are some of these great teachers who should know better so harsh and unfeeling?" "There," he said, as he fastened an herbal compress and helped me to my shaky feet. "There, now you'll be all right. I will give you a new robe and destroy the other." "Ow, Reverend Master!" I exclaimed in some fright, my knees trembling with the shock. "I cannot have a new robe, or everyone will think I'm a new boy just joined. I'd rather have this one." The old infirmarian laughed and laughed, and then said, "Come on, my boy, come with me, and we'll see together what we can do about this weighty matter." Together we walked slowly down the corridor to where the infirmarian had his office. Inside, on tables, ledges, and shelves, there were containers of herbs, a few powdered minerals, and odd items which I could not then identify. Tibetans only sought medical aid in cases of extreme emergency. Not for us, the first aid kits of the West. We managed as nature intended. A broken limb would be set, of course, and a very deep wound stitched. We used the long hairs from horses' tails for stitching. When well boiled, it was very suitable. For stitching the very deepest layers, we used the long fibers from shredded bamboo. The bamboo was also used as a drainage tube when one had to drain pus from an internal wound. Clean, well-washed sphagnum moss made very useful sponge material, and was also used for compresses, with or without herbal ointments. The infirmarian took me into a side room which I had not noticed. From a pile of old and mended robes he drew forth one. It was clean, well mended, and was very sun-faded. My eyes lit up at the sight, for such a robe would show that I had been in the lamasery a long, long time. The infirmarian motioned for me to take off my robe. I did so, and he examined me for other injuries. Skinny, undersized, should be bigger for your age. How old are you, boy?" I told him. "So, I thought you were about 3 years older. Quite a man, eh? Now try on this robe." I swelled out my chest and tried to stand straighter, to look bigger and taller, but my legs would not stretch. The robe was somewhat too big for me, and I tried to conceal the fact. "Ah," said the infirmarian, "you will soon grow and fill it up. Keep it on. Goodbye." But now it was time to eat. Eat before the afternoon classes. I had already lost much time, so I shuffled down to the kitchen where I explained my plight. "Eat, eat, eat, boy, and get on with it," said the friendly soot-streaked cook, helping me generously. The sunlight streamed through the window. I stood with my elbows on the frame, looking out as I ate. At times the temptation was too much, and I flipped a little sampa over the edge of the bowl onto some poor unsuspecting monk far below. "More, boy?" said the cook monk in some astonishment. "More? You must be hollow, or—" He winked slyly at me. "Are you pasting the head of the brothers?" I must have blushed or looked guilty, for he laughed uproariously and said, "Then let's mix a little soot with this lot." But fun could not last forever. My bowl was again empty. Below, an increasingly cross group of monks were wiping their black spattered heads and peering suspiciously about them. One even started up the path. Hastily I withdrew from the kitchen and sauntered as nonchalantly as I could out of the kitchen and into the corridor. As I turned the corner, a glowering monk appeared and hesitated as he saw me. "Let me see your bowl," he growled. Assuming my most innocent expression, I reached into my robe and produced the desired article and handed it over for inspection. "Is something wrong, sir?" I asked. "That really is my bowl," I continued. The monk examined the bowl carefully, looking for traces of the soot which I had so thoroughly removed. He stared at me with the deepest suspicion, then, as he handed the bowl back, said, "Oh, you're the injured one. You could not have climbed the roof. Someone is dropping wet soot on us. He is on the roof, but I will catch him." With that he turned and dashed away towards the roof. I breathed deeply and sauntered on. Behind me there was a chuckle, and the cook monk's voice said, "Well done, boy, you should be an actor. I won't give you away, or I might be the next victim." He hurried past me, off on some mysterious mission connected with food supplies, and I continued on my reluctant way back to the classroom. I was the first one there, and I stood braced in the window, looking out. It always fascinated me to look out across the country from this eminence. The sight of the beggars at the Pargo Kaling, or the Western Gate, and the never-failing thrill of seeing the eternal spume of snow blowing from the highest peaks of the Himalayas. I could spend hours, days watching. Around the district of Lhasa, the mountains formed a great U, the mighty Himalayas which formed the backbone of the continent. Having time on my hands, I looked well, making a game of it. Below me, the white, lime-washed walls of the Potala melted imperceptibly into the living rock of what had once, eons ago, been a volcano. The lime white of the man-made structure flowed into the grey and brown of the mountain, and where the one ended and the other began, no man could say now. They had fused together so successfully. The lower slopes of the mountain were covered by the small bushes through which we boys often crawled when trying to escape detection. Lower still were the buildings forming the village of Sho, with the great courts of justice, the government offices, the government printing works, the civil records offices, and the prison. It was a busy scene. Pilgrims were progressing along the Pilgrim's Way, hoping to acquire virtue by stretching their length on the ground, crawling forward a few feet, and then again lying prone. It certainly looked most amusing from my height above. Monks were striding about energetically between the houses. Must be the proctors after a malefactor, I thought. And lamas were proceeding about their stately business on horseback. An abbot and his retinue turned into our road and slowly rode up the wide, stepped path towards the main entrance. A group of fortune-tellers plied a brisk trade as they extolled the virtues of their horoscopes. "Blessed by a Lord Abbot, mind you, sure to bring you luck." The green of the willows in the marsh across the road attracted me. The fronds were gently swaying in the breeze. Pools of water reflected the racing clouds and changed color according to the color of the passing pedestrians. One fortune teller was established on the brink of a large pool, and he was pretending to read the future of his clients in the sacred water at the foot of the Potala. Trade was brisk indeed. The Pargo Kaling was thronged. Small stalls had been erected, and itinerant traders were doing a sharp business, selling foods and sweetstuffs to the pilgrims. A profusion of amulets and charm boxes were draped over the end of one stall. The turquoise and gold ornaments flashed brightly in the sunlight. Gaily turbaned Indians, heavily bearded and with flashing eyes, strode around looking for bargains and trying to beat down the seller. Opposite towered Shakpori, Iron Mountain, slightly higher than the Potala, but not so ornate, not so many buildings. Shakpori was austere, somewhat grey and grim, but Shakpori was the home of healing, while the Potala was the home of the god. Beyond the Shakpori, the happy river sparkled and chuckled as it made its swift way down to the Bay of Bengal. By shading my eyes and straining a little, I could see the boatman paddling passengers across the river. His inflated yak-hide boat always fascinated me, and I was beginning to wonder if I would not be better as a boatman than as a small acolyte in a large lamasery. But there was no chance to be a boatman yet, as I well knew. I had to get on with my studies first, and whoever heard of a monk becoming a boatman? Far off to the left, the golden roof of the Jokang, or Cathedral of Lhasa, dazzled the eyes as it reflected the sun's rays. I watched the happy river as it wandered through the marshy land, twinkling through the willow groves, and with a small tributary flowing under the beautiful turquoise bridge. Far off I saw a gleaming silver thread diminishing in the distance as the river followed its path towards the flat lowlands. This was a busy day. By leaning out of the window, and with some danger of falling a long, long way, I could see more traders coming along the road from Drepung, coming from the high mountain passes, but it would be some considerable time before they were close enough for me to see details. Classes would start before that. The sides of the mountains were dotted with lamaseries, large ones that were self-contained towns, and small ones which clung precariously to the side of the steep rock pinnacles. Some of the very smallest ones, and the most dangerously positioned, were the hermitages of monks who had renounced the world and were walled into their small cells, there to spend the rest of their life. Was it really good, I wondered, to be so completely cut off? Did it help anyone when a young, healthy man decided to be walled up in a small cell, there to spend perhaps 40 years in total darkness, total silence, while he meditated upon life and tried to break free from the bonds of the flesh? It must be strange, I thought, to never see again, never speak again, never walk again, and to have food only every other day. End of chapter 2.